Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we are going to discuss what is going to be an incredibly important week in European politics. We are recording on Monday, December 15th. On Thursday, December 18th, when this podcast is likely going to come out, there's going to be a flurry of activities because that is when the European Council will have its summit in Brussels. We're also going to talk today about German Chancellor Friedrich Merz offered a really blunt assessment of transatlantic relations at a party conference in Munich, declaring the era of Pax Americana dead ahead of Ukraine peace talks in Berlin and following the national security strategy being released here in Washington. What European leaders will be discussing this week are two critical initiatives. First is on the Mercosur trade deal. This trade deal has been negotiated for decades, but is at the finish line. They just have to vote for it and vote to pass it. And then Ursula von der Leyen would be on a plane. She would be in Brazil. The thing would be signed. Huge accomplishment, a whole message to the world. That is being discussed. And there's now some real issues, at least appearing at the beginning of this week. The second are the frozen Russian assets that are sitting in the Belgian financial institution Euroclear. There's a reparations loan being proposed, basically a loan off these frozen assets that would go to Ukraine, help finance the war. That is also under consideration, and there's a new potential opponent, possibly Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Then, at the end of all of this, we are going to turn to our conversation with Dr. Thu Nguyen, acting co-director of the Jacques Delors Center, to discuss the state of democracy in the EU. Donatien, let's start with Friedrich Merz, his speech at a party conference. What did he say? Why does this matter?
Well, as you mentioned in the intro, he talked about basically the end of the Pax Americana, which had kind of ruled the world for the last few decades. And that meant having the United States basically be the anchor of the global order as we know it, the institutions that are attached to it. Of course, that also means a very close transatlantic relationship, which the Germans obviously have relied on very, very heavily, from the political and economic relationship to the defense relationship, of course. So he talked about that and the importance for Europe to really step up. That takes multiple shapes, but one of them, of course, is related to Ukraine because of those peace talks that are happening in Berlin. I think it's pretty important for Merz to be the one saying those things. We know that Germany has waffled about quite a bit and been so concerned about the end of what they knew their relationship with the United States to be and what that meant for Europe, what that meant for Germany. They've hit the brakes before on too much trade retaliation based on obviously what this administration was doing. So for him to come out and say this like this, I think is really important. It's a very clear message he's sending also to his counterparts ahead of this council meeting later this week. And coming from Germany, which anytime something happens in Europe, we all turn our eyes to Berlin, and they are a really important engine for things to happen. The one caveat for me is, yes, it's great for him to say it, but what's he doing to show for it? And that's what I want to see at this council meeting, because yes, Germany is all for the reparations loans, using the frozen assets. What if that doesn't work? Would they support just a full-on EU loan, which obviously requires unanimity?
Eurobonds.
There we go. We know Germany has not been super keen on something like this and borrowing together. So words are great. They are important for him to say so strikingly. Hopefully his party comes along as well. But I'd like to see a little more.
This speech really harkens back to the language that we saw from him after the Munich Security Conference, after the night he won the election, talking about sort of the need for Europe to basically embrace strategic autonomy. And what we see is that there's a few big issues now on the table that Germany is pushing. One, which we're not really going to talk about today, is it looks like Germany is moving on capital markets union, something we've talked about in the past. They've proposed a pan-European stock exchange. That proposal is basically to try to get Europe to have the same pools of big venture capital that can help get startups into big companies. That's probably the main reason why Europe doesn't have a tech sector, not regulation. So real movement there. On reparations loan, as much as I think Eurobonds is just in some ways better, this is actually a very good way of doing it. Makes a lot of sense. It's probably politically easier. So there's really good reasons to do the reparations loan. And he is pushing that forward. He, flew to Brussels to meet with the Belgian prime minister to really twist his arm and push on other ways. So let's start with the frozen Russian assets. The U.S. is not providing any more money to Ukraine, right? All the weapons that are flowing to Ukraine from the United States were paid for under the Biden administration. So there's no more money, and those weapons are falling off. So it's really up to Europe to both finance Ukraine's economy, because it runs massive shortfalls, and to finance the war effort. So how are you going to do this? You need about $80 billion a year. Well, they've identified $140 billion that they can tap at Euroclear that they can use. And then this would help keep Ukraine whole and in the war. So this has been dragging on for months. There's a lot of technicalities here. I think some of the points that the Belgians make are legitimate, that they don't want to be kind of holding the bag, so to speak, or on the hook of just trying to conjure 140 billion euros in like 10, 15 years if Russia sues them and then they're awarded. They want this to sort of have pan-European backing. That made a lot of sense. There are also questions of how they were going to go about getting this loan, because if you're going to take a loan for 140 billion, but every 6 months you have to renew sanctions, and if those sanctions are not renewed, then that means this frozen money could be unfrozen, could be thawed out, and it would then go back to Russia. And the sanctions requiring unanimity, which means that the Hungarians, everyone sort of overlooks this, the Hungarians, every 6 months since 2014 have been approving sanctions on Russia. But the fear that if they didn't, Orban could take this ultimate hostage. And so what the EU did, they invoked Article 122 of the treaty, which basically said, like, we're going to do this around qualitative majority voting because this is an economic emergency. I think it's actually quite significant, demonstrating when essentially the EU has unanimity, it can move. But now we have Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and they're in Berlin and wanting these frozen assets going to U.S. companies. And so they're tied up in the peace negotiations merry-go-round. And I think that's why Giorgia Meloni has sort of raised her hand and said, I don't know if I'm on board with this plan. And so now there's new challenges to trying to get the frozen Russian assets to get the reparations loan done.
Yeah, I think what's also interesting, it's not just Italy. So for the broader context, Belgium had been the main opponent to this plan unless it got very clear assurances that it wouldn't be left holding the bag on the money that's on the frozen assets that are in Euroclear. But in the last few days, Italy, but also Bulgaria and Malta, for some reason, have decided that they want to put their support behind an alternative to the frozen assets plan. Unclear what alternative they're talking about. I don't see a lot of new proposals on the table. But that constellation of countries is just kind of an interesting mix to me. Meloni, yes, could very well be because of the connections with the US side. Belgium had also said, well, if we do this, it could be an impediment to the peace efforts that are going on. That is not by far their most convincing argument to this thing. Meanwhile, we still have a permanent freeze, the Article 122 that you were talking about, on these assets, which should help. I think what's difficult to look at, because all of these countries have said, well, if you try to move, because there are ways you could move through some of this through QMV, qualified majority voting, which is not unanimity, and they don't have enough to block that decision among themselves. So you could have reparations loans basically without them supporting it. It's a bit of a problem. Kaja Kallas had said she would really prefer not to do this. But I think what I'm looking at, and obviously like from my own perch of being from Belgium, is this feels like Belgium, who had always been a supporter of doing things at the European level, moving forward integration, is now moving into a camp where they're saying, we don't like qualified majority voting. It sets a bad precedent if you do this for security and foreign policy decisions. Seems like that's a pretty significant shift. At the same time, there was just a very big poll in Belgium across a range of issues, including this. And they found that 67% of people don't want to use the frozen assets. The highest percentage is in Flanders, which is where the prime minister is from. So that's another problem that comes on top of all of this. Like, there's public support for his position. The thing that I'm taking from that is just this shift from Belgium that is moving away from a big supporter of institutional integration and foreign policy integration. And that doesn't mean it blocks the decision by any means.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, to me, I think what is always difficult about assessing European politics, particularly as we get down to the finish line of getting things done, is that it looks a lot more like congressional legislation than it does sort of high foreign policy, where this is about trading of small things. If I was going to try to assess Italy's approach, maybe Giorgia Meloni got a call from Trump pushing her, saying, don't block peace, that if you freeze these assets, it'll be an obstacle to peace. I mean, they could always unfreeze them, right? If there's suddenly peace and this loan's not necessary, I don't know.
They'll find a way.
Okay, you make this concession to Washington where you look like you're on Washington's side, and this is going to pass anyway. So you vote against the loan. People are sort of mad at you in Brussels, but they also know that you didn't actually take enough action to prevent the thing from happening. And I do think that there is this potential for some of the more right-wing, far-right parties that want to stake out a position where they're kind of more in the Trumpian, quote-unquote, pro-peace camp, where they're for peace. And this may be where Andrej Babiš is with Czechia as well, the Czech Republic. Oh, we're against this loan because supporting this loan means being against the peace talks and trying to create that schism within Europe. But even a more cynical hat would say, well, there's also going to be budget negotiations that take place for the EU's budget. And this is maybe a way of, what does Meloni get for making a concession? Maybe not on the reparations loan, but then maybe on Mercosur, on the trade deal. So there's, shocked that there's politics that take place and horse trading and negotiations when you have 27 leaders that all see an ability to kind of move things around. And this always gets focused on Viktor Orban because he does it in the most kind of obtuse way. But this is not uncommon. To take a step back, I think if the reparations loan fails this week, I am not that concerned because the EU will find a way to do this. They have to find a way to do this. They're not going to let Ukraine collapse into a heap of ruin. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't mean, the end for Ukraine. It just means that political pressure is going to rebuild back up, and then the Europeans would have to find a way. The danger would be it prompts people like Merz and others to say, we can't do this through the EU, through a European solution. If they don't get these reparations loan done, something will get done for Ukraine then in 2026, but it may be damaging for the EU if it doesn't actually get this through the EU through this loan.
Yeah, I think that's right. On the flip side, if it works and they go through with reparations loan using the assets as collateral, which means they can do it with QMV, that might antagonize some member states, but it shows a real willingness to push this forward and say, we make trade-offs all the time here. We do things that make some other member states unhappy because we have decided that in the grand scheme of things, this is good for us. And it pursues a larger goal that, to my knowledge, we have all agreed we want Ukraine to succeed. I think that would be a really good sign. And on the flip side, it's not good for the EU, but something would happen. And I think that's a similar dynamic going on with Mercosur. This waiting for Godot trade deal has been going on for 25 years in negotiations, and we thought this is it. Now we are facing a situation where the French might push back on the agreement of this deal. You mentioned Meloni as well. Italy might have some concerns, and if Meloni feels like she has the backing of another capital, she might try to push this forward as well. It's just one more issue set where it's not the end of the European Union if they don't sign it, but it has some pretty significant consequences if it doesn't pass, which is you are trying to present yourself as kind of the last big defender of the international trading system that we've all built. The United States has decided to go a different way, but you can't even do this with a pretty important trading zone. So for partners, that sends, even competitors, that sends a certain signals. Like, why would we work with you or see you as the defender of this trade order? And then on the flip side, that could be a really strong signal to send. It's just the risk of failures, like once again, the risk of outlining a clear vision for what the European Union wants to be.
Yeah, this may be a hot take, but I actually think this might be more important for the EU than the reparations loan, because I think they'll figure out a way. If the reparations loan fails, there'll be another way to get money and financing to Ukraine. But if the Mercosur deal fails, they've been negotiating for 25 years. It's done. The EU had the support to do it and maybe to invoke Nancy Pelosi. They had the vote in the summer. If you have the vote, take the vote. They didn't take the vote because they didn't want to play into French politics. And when was ever going to be a good time in French politics? Never. And so why I think this really matters is that the EU, as we've talked about with the former Director General for Trade, Cecilia Malmström, is that the EU has an agenda to try to keep the liberal global trading order afloat by trying to do deals with India, Indonesia, all the CPTPP countries, the UAE. I think this really will inhibit the EU's narrative and ability to say, we are the port in the storm right now when it comes to trade. And what's happening is the EU is getting its lunch eaten economically. It's losing access to the US market and also the Chinese market. And so this is where Maloney coming in. And what's surprising here is not actually France, because France was always sort of on the cusp. They could vote against it or they could abstain. And again, the issue is you have qualitative majority voting. So you don't need unanimity. This is not about getting Hungary and everyone to agree. You have to get basically 2/3 support. If you cannot pass this deal after lots of compromises and everything's sort of been worked out, then maybe we are really in a new global trading order. And that would require far more radical approach when it comes to Europe's economic posture. So we'll see. That will also be discussed on Thursday. The plan was for von der Leyen to get on a plane and go to Brazil to sign the agreement. So a lot is happening this week.
A lot, so much happening. And just to briefly summarize what the landscape we're seeing across all of the issues that we just discussed is that if failure happens, again, it's not like Brussels falls into a hole, never to emerge again. Yeah. It's just that it confirms all these accusations about weakness coming out of Brussels, being a united bloc, and it seeds influence and credibility to others when partners around the world are looking towards the EU to say, can we work with you? Because we're in a very unstable world order and we would love to have a little bit of an anchor. And it also, unfortunately, would prove that all these lofty ambitions and words are somewhat empty. And there's an inability to show real political will if they fail across these different files, especially on trade. Now, if there's success, obviously that's a huge breakthrough. And that means political will can take over, and they're not always looking over their shoulder. As you mentioned, like the next election in Slovenia, oh my God, what if something we do in Brussels has implications over there? But then what they do means we can't do anything. So it feels like pretty important fork in the road.
Yeah, maybe just to look ahead to 2026 is sort of the last point here. There's a lot of questions about how Europe now approaches the United States, how it approaches the world, particularly after the national security strategy. We won't really get into details here. You can see the previous episode. But look, if they fail on these two accounts or split the difference even, it really hits the vibes going into 2026. And you're going to have Hungarian elections, which don't look like they're going in Viktor Orban's direction. So there is a path where prior to the French elections of 2027, that there is actually a path to get quite a bit done to move Europe forward on the capital markets union, to move forward on global trade agenda, as we've talked about, and then to also sort of take a stronger approach when it comes to protecting against China, supporting Ukraine, European defense. There's a lot on the agenda for Europeans to do, implementing the Draghi report. And it feels like if they can't get these things done, then that will inhibit everything else. That doesn't mean Europe is over. America goes through periods of stagnation for a while, but it does sort of make 2026 seem rather gloomy. Maybe this political moment is over and then Europe is just waiting for the next round of big elections to set a new course for sort of the post-Macron era. But that we can save to discuss for future podcasts. This will be our last podcast of 2025. And I think it's a good time to turn to our conversation with Dr. Nguyen.
We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Thu Nguyen to the Eurofile. Thu is acting co-director of the Jacques Delors Center at the Hertie School. She leads the think tank's work on institutional questions of EU policy. In her own work, she mainly focuses on EU institutional reform, rule of law, democracy, and economic governance, which we'll talk about today. She's also the host of the Jacques Delors Center podcast, EU to Go, der Podcast für Europapolitik. She has given evidence on the subject of EU institutional reform and EU economic governance in a lot of committee hearings in the Bundestag and the European Parliament. And in January 2023, she was appointed by the German government to the Franco-German expert group on EU institutional reforms. Thu, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start big picture, as we love to do on the Eurofile. There's been a lot of conversations in the last at least couple years, let's say,
on potential return of far-right forces, liberal forces across the continent in Europe, potential prioritization of other files like defense and competitiveness over some of those issues. In your view, where do we stand on the state of democracy across Europe?
I think on these questions, there's probably a few dimensions. The one is the one you mentioned, the surge of far right and partially undemocratic actors, both at the European level and the national level. There was, of course, in 2024, the European Parliament elections beforehand, there was this very big fear of sort of a far right surge also in the European Parliament. I think what we have seen is at least a rise in far-right actors across the member states in the parliament. I think they now make up a quarter of the seats in the European Parliament, and we can talk about this later. But of course, there is sort of also the far-right shift in terms of policies that come with this surge or this difference in majority in the European Parliament. And the other dimension is the question of how powerful are far-right actors in the member states, and are they taking over in national governments and at the national level, and how far does that pose a danger or risk to democracy, both in member states and at the European level? And I think also here, I mean, we've had a number of elections also this year. Some, I think, were perhaps less good for liberal democracy than others, with the two biggest looming questions at the moment, I think, being, first of all, the national elections in Hungary next year and the French presidential elections in 2027. Both will have quite an impact on also the democratic state of the EU.
What's been the response to this that you've seen across the EU? I'm curious, especially about the tools that currently exist or have been created to try to respond to this, because obviously the rise of some of these forces is creating problems for other member states, for Brussels. Could you share a little bit more about especially newer things that the Commission has announced, from the Democracy Shield and the EU strategy for civil society? We're hearing a lot about new instruments, which I guess is kind of classic coming out of Brussels. But what are the core institutions that are there to support some of this democracy work?
So the European Commission is the guardian of the treaties in the EU. So it really is for the European Commission also to protect the values of the European Union, including democracy and the rule of law. On the rule of law, we've had a number of tools throughout the almost decades by now, with the latest in 2021 being the rule of law conditionality mechanism, whereby the European Commission member states can withhold funds from national governments that breach the rule of law. Recently, we've also had sort of a number of activities from the European Commission that relate to defense of democracy package, the Democracy Shield, which was recently proposed by the Commission. And a lot of these instruments target or aim to protect European democracy from external threats and from foreign influence online, from disinformation, and really external threats to European democracy. A lot of it is also framed from the security lens, or protection of democracy also as part of European security, which I think is, of course, the protection of democracy is or should be part of the European security agenda. At the same time, this move towards framing democracy as something that we need to do in order to hold security, of course, sometimes leaves a gap when it comes to the dangers that come from within. So there's a big focus on threats that come from the outside, and perhaps a bit less at the moment the dangers that really originate from the EU and its member states.
To pick up on something you said earlier about the rise of the far-right parties, I guess one question is, are you starting to see differences amongst the far-right parties? And I guess to maybe break it apart even further, it strikes me that there's far-right parties that, are far-right, have various views, but then there are those that are, when they take power, then work to undermine the rule of law. How are you seeing the kind of far-right in the sense? Is it as a bloc anti-democratic, or are there kind of differences? Now, in the European Parliament, there are a number of different far-right parties. We've seen Giorgia Meloni become Prime Minister of Italy, but not really do the same things that we have seen in Hungary with Orban. So how do you think about that?
I think there is in the discussions, and also I think in the EPP, the conservatives, this notion that there are differences in far-right actors, the good far-right actors and bad far-right actors. If we sort of look at the European Parliament, they are now divided in three groups, right? We have the European Conservatives and Reformers, ECR, which is headed by Meloni. Then we have the Patriots for Europe, which is the Orban, Le Pen, Bardella faction. And then we have the Europeans of Sovereign Nations, Sovereignists, which is basically the German AfD. And I think the difficulty is that in each of these groups composed of different national delegates, right? So even within the groups, it's not as cohesive as we know it from the national level. And I know that there's sometimes the notion that the ECR, so the one that is headed by Meloni, is less problematic than perhaps the Patriots or the Sovereignists. At the same time, we also have to acknowledge that the ECR, yes, perhaps Meloni has been able to position herself as this constructive actor, also in the European Council and within the European system. But the ECR also composes the Polish PiS, which is the party in Poland that has been at odds with European values and the European Commission and the member states for a very long time on rule of law problems. Right? So I think there is a certain complication in this, and that there is no coherence even within the groups and within the member states that sit on the far right in the European Parliament.
So how has the EU approached Hungary and Poland? Because what strikes me is that they are able to actually work around Hungary to get things done. Sanctions get passed. Things are happening at the EU level. Hungary is an obstacle on a lot of things. They do block a lot of things. But on the other hand, they don't block everything. And so what levers has the EU employed? How is the EU approaching Hungary in this way? Is it just constant paying Orban off? What are the strategies and tactics that the EU has employed?
So the EU has a number of instruments, right, to deal with rule of law violations in the member states. And it ranges from infringement proceedings, where sort of the Commission says member states violate EU law, to really rule of law instruments, including Article 7, which is the procedure whereby member states can be deprived of certain rights, including voting rights in the Council. It's never gone anywhere. It has been triggered against Poland and Hungary. It's been stuck for many, many years. I think we can sort of assume it will continue to be stuck because you need unanimity to impose those sanctions. And there's a certain reluctance in member states to, first of all, sanction their peers, and also always more than one member state at the risk of being sanctioned. So they protect each other. I think if we sort of look historically, the rule of law issues in Poland and Hungary, especially Hungary, have been ongoing for a very long time, right? So in Hungary, it's been 15 years. And I think the EU and the European Commission really took some time to sort of get there and really to be able to not only have the instrument, but also sort of be able to use the instruments. And I think on the one hand, it is good that the instruments have been used, but we also see on what we've seen in the past, I would say 2 years, is an increasing politicization of these instruments. So also with regard to Hungary and the frozen EU funds, there was this instance in December 2023 where there was a European Council and it was about the Ukraine aid and Ukraine opening accession negotiations with Ukraine. So I think there is this certain tension at all times with regard to how much do we uphold the rule of law and sort of enforce the instruments that we have, and how much do we trade it with policy goals that we have. And I think with Hungary, at least now, we have reached threshold of frustration amongst the other member states, among the other heads of states and governments, whereby they simply really try to circumvent Hungary, as you say. So we've also seen this new pattern of adopting European Council conclusions on Ukraine with only 26 member states, without Hungary. This is really new development. It hasn't happened in the past. So I think there is now sort of this will and these attempts to simply say, clearly there's one member state that is so far off of our common interests that we will simply try to circumvent.
We also saw recently a change of government in the Czech Republic, and we're likely to see, Andrej Babiš is going to Brussels this week. There's a council meeting next week, so he's going to be back at the table with people he has worked with before, but it's pretty different Andrej Babiš that we're facing now. So we're starting to see in some of these places that there's a return of people who were in power before, but now are coming back, you could say, with a vengeance. We see a lot of these things happening at the national level. You talked a little bit about the European Parliament before, but some of these dynamics are really starting to trickle up. I mean, we see parties like the AfD starting to, well, not just AfD, but other parties supporting efforts to do away with some EU regulation, but also some center-right parties are starting to allow this to happen. Whereas at the national level, they would never align so visibly. What's your view of what we're likely to see in the coming year, 2 years, that is honestly like trickling up from the national level and starting to, I don't want to say infect, but just be contagious at the European level?
I think my fear is even that it will be the other way around. So I think what we have now in the European Parliament, and that is different than from previous legislatures, is that the EPP, so the European People's Party, the Conservatives, basically can choose their majorities. They can do it with the center-left and the von der Leyen majorities, as it is informally called, so with the Social Democrats and the Liberals and perhaps the Greens, or they can choose their majorities on their right, on the far right side, with ECR, Patriots and Sovereignists. And different than before, there is no other majority. There's no majority on the left of the EPP without BP, and there's no majority on the right of the EPP without the EPP. So really, the EPP is the kingmaker and can choose. There's, of course, also different forces at play, not just in the far-right groups, but also in the EPP. So, of course, there's some national delegations that rather align with center-left and others that really push more towards the right side of parliament. And we will now have to see where this goes. But I think there is a limit as to how much constructive EU policy is possible with Eurosceptic actors. So if it comes to the new multi-annual financial framework, when it comes to security, when it comes to rule of law, there is, of course, a necessity for a stable majority in the center. And the more the EPP sort of gravitates towards the far right, the less stability this center and this von der Leyen majority will have. And that will also become a problem for the European Commission. If it can no longer rely on a stable majority in the European Parliament to push through its own agenda, then the whole system becomes much more unstable than we used to, actually.
So we are talking a week after the release of the new U.S. national security strategy. A big part of that strategy when it came to Europe is essentially for the U.S. government to begin interfering in European politics, back and support and promote the far right and nationalist parties in Europe. So I'm curious, how did you see the national security strategy? What do you think the reaction will be in Europe? And what are the tools that Europe will have to kind of preserve its democratic space against foreign interference?
I think the reaction was sort of a mix of shock, but also of saying, okay, this is a continuation of what we've already heard from the US and what we've heard J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference. And perhaps this is now in written the push that is needed for Europe to also become more independent of the US. I think in terms of foreign influence and protecting European democratic space, and how can we protect also the online sphere as a place of democratic debate for Europe, right? And I think this is sort of also one issue that really has been at the heart of many debates and negotiations. How much do we sort of stand up for our own rules? How much are we able to stand up for the rules that we have made? And how much can we enforce our own rules the way we want to? And how do we sort of protect our own democracy and our own sovereignty in this?
I think that's a great message for us to leave it. I'm really grateful that we could talk to you because it's a defining question for the next few years in Europe. There's so many big ambitions coming out of the member states, but also coming out of Brussels on competitiveness, supporting citizens, climate transition, Ukraine, all these things. And I don't see how any of this moves forward on a stable basis without a stable democratic governance. And there's only so much the EU can do at the moment without a big push of political will. As you said, it's a question of whether Brussels wants to enforce the rules that it has and the values that it protects. So, Thu, thank you so much for coming on the Eurofile. We're hoping to stay in touch with you on these issues, and happy holidays.
Thank you for having me, and happy holidays to you too.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.